Okay, so I want to talk about Edmund Burke's view of natural rights today. He has a critique of Enlightenment liberal rights that is well worth listening to. This is a French revolutionary 10-hour clock, and I put it there because I want to remind people that the French revolutionaries had a very abstract Enlightenment notion of how people ought to live, and they wanted to apply this rational idea in every area of life. And so one of the things that they did, just as a for instance, was they changed the 12-hour clock to a 10-hour clock. Everything was going to run on the decimal system. So this created mass confusion. So they had to add this other layer, or at least the French, people added this extra layer of the 12-hour clock around it just so that things could continue to go on and business be conducted at all. And this kind of represents, Burke's problem with abstract principles being applied to people. He didn't think that there was this one-size-fits-all universal set of principles. He was very revolted by that, and he thought it did violence to people, that it was actually, like a cruel thing to do, to impose abstract concepts like this on people, and there were many, many of them. He thought that rights are particular to a people, and therefore they can change both from nation to nation and also, even across time. They were not this fixed set that could be applied universally to all. And when you do try to do that, you inevitably do violence. Instead, he thought rights were a kind of inheritance, built from below across time in particular places. And so they would vary from place to place as far as what would be the rights of that particular people or groups of people. He says, for instance, the people of England look upon the legal hereditary succession of their crown as among their rights, right? In 1688, they preserved this principle of the inherited monarchy as their right. Okay, not every country has a monarch, right? But England did, and so this worked for them, and so this counted as one of their rights. He said, "We wished at the period of the Revolution of 1688, and do now wish to derive all we possess as an inheritance from our forefathers. Upon that body and stock of inheritance, we have taken care not to inoculate any scion alien to the nature of the original plant." That's a kind of graft. You don't want to take something that's totally foreign to the other plant that won't really graft onto it. Right? But you want to take something that will actually blend into it. And that's what he thought they did when they brought William and Mary into power in the Glorious Revolution. All the reformations we have hitherto have made proceeded upon the principle of reverence to antiquity. And so even if they did deviate and change their constitution, in some respects more than maybe Burke wants to acknowledge here, they did continue with the principle of reverence to what had happened in the past. And this helped create continuity. And Burke is very much about continuity. So if you're thinking, would he like, the fact that the English still have a monarch, but, that monarch doesn't have very much power compared to days gone by? Probably, because he says the idea of inheritance furnishes a sure principle of conservation and a sure principle of transmission without at all excluding a principle of improvement. Right? So just as a house can be inherited from one generation to the next, which, by the way, he would very much approve of because that's what it takes for families to accumulate wealth, something that doesn't happen nearly as often for ordinary people in the current capitalist system. But you can take that house and you can improve it over time, and you should maybe even repurpose it. Maybe it goes from being a residence to being an inn to being a wedding destination, but there's nothing precluding that. But by keeping it, you're passing on something valuable to the next generation that they can then work with and use. Same thing with a monarchy. So I don't think he would disapprove of this because the English have continued to change over time, but have kept their traditions and their sense of continuity, and that is, of course, the magic ingredient for political stability in his view. He wants people to think of their government and their social relations in terms of family and not contract. And so he's contrasting his own people with the French and their way, their current revolutionary way of thinking, which was very much about the social contract. Everyone's an individual with rights, and they make a contract, they form a government that's supposed to protect those rights and protect their self-interest. But Burke thinks that that's a very flimsy foundation, that there's not enough there for there to be order and there to be, loyalty that provides like enough strength to withstand a hiccup or two, a bump or two, right? If we think in terms of social contract, as soon as the contract is violated at all, we may start thinking about breaking that contract. But breaking the contract means revolution, maybe for frivolous reasons. Burke says that the old way is a better way, to think in terms of the polity as a family. He says, we have given to our frame of polity the image of a relation in blood-family relations, binding up the constitution of our country with our dearest domestic ties, like a family, adopting our fundamental laws into the bosom of our family affections. So just as we love our family and its traditions, our government, our country, and its laws become like that, revered by us. Keeping inseparable and cherishing the warmth of all their combined and mutually reflected charities, our state, our hearths, our sepulchres, which is our graves, and our altars, all tied up into what is more strong than a social contract in his view, this idea of the nation as a larger family, right? And all of the relationships within it being familial. He then goes into a discussion of the, quote, real rights of men, as opposed to the abstract rights of the French revolutionaries. This listing of rights is not your liberal rendition, right? And it is somewhat transferable to other peoples. I mean, he's primarily thinking about the English, but the way that is put could be somewhat transferable to other peoples who might interpret the details of it very differently. He then goes into the section on what he considers to be the real rights of men for their real benefit, right? It's not a right if it doesn't benefit people, right? Or it only benefits some but not others, right? In his view, that's a defect of the liberal Enlightenment view of rights. So he says, for instance, things like people have the right to the advantages of the society in which they live, to avail themselves of the relationships, of the material benefits, to be able to lift themselves up. He says that they have a right to live by the rule of beneficence or kindness. He says they have a right to do justice to their fellows, to live like human beings who care about whether their fellow human beings are suffering or being treated unfairly. They have a right to the fruits of their industry, the fruits of their work. But he says they also have a right of the means of making their industry fruitful. So if people are left to their own devices and they aren't given any sort of lift up through this family of relationships, right, then they have not received their right. If they're left to just sort of fend for themselves and they don't have the resources to make their industry fruitful. He says they have the right to the acquisitions of their parents. Strictly speaking, that means property inheritance, and this is the only way that and wealth can be accumulated over time. They have the right to the nourishment and improvement of their offspring, to be able to foster their children, to help children to grow up well, to become adults, and that means instruction in life, that younger people have a right to receive from their elders and from society the knowledge that they need to be able to do their business in life and to thrive. He says we have a right to consolation in death, and we should not be left alone in our grief. So these are lots of very social rights, that correspond to duties. We have a duty to do all these things for our fellow human beings. We don't have a right to do whatever we want, regardless of the impact on other people. He says we have a right to what we can each do without trespassing on each other's rights. But if you take into account the nature of the rights he's talked about already, then that means that we shouldn't do things or can't do things, according to this view of rights, that impedes others' human flourishing, that gets in the way of these family relationships. He says we have a right to the fair portion of all which society can do in our favor. Right? And that means we have a right to restraints upon our liberty. This is a very different view. Again, very anti-liberal in a way, or non-liberal anyway. We have a right to be restrained, because if we have a society in which there are very few restraints, both legal as well as social, upon our actions, then all of this social fabric will start to fray. All that supports people's flourishing will start to disintegrate. And so we can't afford to have all that liberty. And I would say this is like one of the chief insights of Burke that speaks to our situation today, is that we don't think in those terms. He goes on to talk about these metaphysic rights, and I think he's referring to the Enlightenment liberal rights, right, that the French are embracing at the moment. And he says, government is not made in virtue of natural rights, which may and do exist in total independence of it, and they exist in much greater clearness and in much greater degree of abstract perfection, but their abstract perfection is their practical defect. If you take a set of abstract rights and you try to impose them on people, no matter who they are, where they are, what they've been through before, what you're going to do is not justice, but violence. Right? So that's what he means by their abstract perfection is their practical defect. They may exist up there in the realm of ideals. And if everybody was a completely rational, self-interested automaton, or atom perhaps, then maybe it would work. But since that's not the case, you can't easily translate those abstract rights into actual practice. So he starts talking about this as in terms of a prism. He says these metaphysic rights entering into common life are like rays of light which pierce into a dense medium and are by the laws of nature refracted from their straight line. Indeed, in the gross and complicated mass of human passions and concerns, the primitive rights of men undergo such a variety of refractions and reflections that it becomes absurd to talk of them as if they continued in the simplicity of their original direction. Okay, so as they come into life, they pass through this prism, which is our actual history, our practices, our differences. And they don't come out the other end looking the same. So in place to place and time to time, they're going to look very different, right? And they're going to fit the people within them. And so if you try to take those metaphysic rights and take out the prism, well, first of all, you can't do that, he thinks. But if you did, what you would get is what the French revolutionaries did, which is this really rather catastrophic experiment that does not work, because they are attempting to sort of bypass human nature. He embraces this natural inequality, right? Even within a particular society, not everybody's equal. They're equally deserving of support from their society, but they do occupy different places in society. He puts it in terms of money here, but I don't think he just means money. This is a sort of metaphor. So yes, money matters. So does rank, right? And so does knowledge, as we know. But he says in this partnership, all men have equal rights, but not to equal things. He that has but 5 shillings in the partnership has as good a right to it as he that has 500 pounds to his larger proportion. And he was an advocate for proportional representation in Parliament. So, according to how much property one had and how much tax one paid, one would have more weight, in the assembly than somebody else. He did support that because he said he has not a right to an equal dividend of the product of the joint stock. Okay, so to this extent, those who are better off or contribute more to society through their taxes or through their knowledge and leadership deserve more power, is more or less what he's saying here. They don't necessarily deserve more money, but they do deserve more power and influence. He says, as to the share of power, authority, and direction which each individual ought to have in the management of the state, that I must deny to be amongst the direct original rights of man in civil society, for I have in my contemplation the civil social man and no other. It is a thing to be settled by convention. Okay, so there he's taking a whack at this idea of radical democracy, in which each individual is equal to every other in their political power, in their representation in the assembly, or directly. He does not think it works, and I'm sure I'll talk more about that as time goes by. So, all right, thanks.